I'll try that.
Good evening. On behalf of the county, Canaan Associates and DPZ Code Design, welcome to the second meeting of Series 3. My name is Marina Corey. I'm with DPZ, and I'm joined by Matt Lambert and Mike Wyke. From Canaan, we have Eliza Giuliano with us, as well as many more from the county, including Alberto, Olin, Greg, and others. We will all be helping answer your questions during the 2 questions and answers sessions we have today. As a reminder, Series 1 was an introduction to the comprehensive plan and the particularities of each of the 6 market areas. Series 2 was an introduction to sectors and place types intended to provide guidance on the degree of intensity for the future growth within each market area in a more predictable manner. It answers a lot of questions you may have about the comp plan as it relates to issues of transportation, traffic, density, and others. So I encourage you to go view the recordings at the Vision 2050 website. Series 3 is now about the zoning code, which supports the Vision 2050 comprehensive plan and actually provides the regulations for zoning controls that guide development and conservation. This first series is technical, but also interesting, we hope. It highlights what our physical assessment of the county reveals, explains the difficulty with the current code, and introduces you to what is a form-based code and how the new code, which we are calling Orange Code, is organized around a powerful tool called the Transect, which essentially defines the different character zones within the county. Series 3 is different to the other 2 and is divided into 3 sets of meetings. Tonight's meeting is a repeat of yesterday's. The second set in early June will describe in detail the different zoning categories and their massing form and permitted uses. The third set in early July will discuss all else that goes into zoning, subdivisions, parking, signage, and such. So we look forward to your participation, your collaboration and engagement with this team as we refine the new Orange Code, which is the regulatory tool to enable the objectives in your comprehensive plan that deal with the sustainability, affordability, the vibrant public realm, the housing choices, and increased walkability you have all indicated you want. We are live streaming across many platforms and gathering questions in real time to answer at the end of the presentation. And now I'll turn it over to Alberto Vargas, the Planning Director, for welcoming remarks and to also acknowledge the commissioners who are also in attendance.
Thank you, Marina, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for your presence this evening. We really appreciate your time. Without your continued engagement into this process, both efforts of the reorganization of the comprehensive plan and the update to the land development code would not be possible. So we really and highly appreciate your presence. As you heard Marina's introduction, we have been meeting since December through April of this year, and within the elements of the concepts that we have been sharing with everybody, it generally frames the framework, and you have been helpful in terms of us modifying that framework and adjusting it to the needs of each individual community. Orange Code's existing land development and the existing update to the land development code is strategic to identify those specific places that we're familiar with, the places that currently exist, and those that are planned for the future as we continue to grow for the next 30 years. The current code, as you know, has sections and subsections that are devoted to land uses, like the residential land uses, industrial, commercial. And Orange Code really begins to recognize the fact that the county itself is very diverse, not only in its topography, but the character of development that happens, as well as the lifestyles. So it capitalizes on that and begins to implement the policies that are being drafted for the future growth. Those regulations are adjusted to those specific communities. The fundamental that we're going to be listening and learning about tonight and sharing with you has become best practice throughout the nation. This code update provides opportunities to think about development in Orange County differently, certainly in a different way that we have been thinking about for the last 30 years. Looking to design solutions with a specific different lens for the purpose of preserving or building great communities and neighborhoods in a much more sustainable manner. So with that, tonight, I am going to recognize the presence of Lee Perry with District 1 Office. Commissioner Nicole Wilson is with us. Thank you, Lee, for being with us tonight.
You know what? It's actually me. I'm not sure why Lee's name is on there, but I'm just grateful that either way that I was able to join. I had so much fun last night that I had to jump back in. I really am grateful for all of the engagement that your team and the consultants have gone through in this process. And I also want to reiterate what I said last night, which was to the residents that are tuning in, that some of these issues can sound a little more complex the first go around, but I encourage you to stay plugged in, to stay the course, and to please reach out to my office that we will talk through it. I want to hear your feedback. I know the planning team wants to hear, because I really believe the community knows what's best for them, and they've lived really with the consequences of planning to date. And I know that really accommodating residential growth, it can't be at the expense of our rivers and our forests, and those things are precious to the people in this county. So stay plugged in, and I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. We also have with us tonight Rose Nancy Joseph. Is that you, Rose Nancy, or is it Commissioner Victoria Siplin with the District 6 office? No response from either one, so I'm pretty sure the office is present. Somebody from District 6 is present, so welcome and thank you for your time. I'm sure that if there are other comments throughout the presentation, we'll hear from them. Go ahead.
It's Rose Nancy. Just wanted, I couldn't get myself off the mute. Okay. This is Rose Nancy with Commissioner Siflin's office. Just wanting to say hello to everyone.
Very good. Thank you, Rose Nancy, for being with us tonight. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt so we can get started tonight's program. Thank you, Matt Member.
Great. Thanks, Alberto. Tonight, we'll provide background and an introduction to Orange Code. It's really the why and what, covering broad concepts. The next pair of meetings will detail the new zoning districts, uses, and other related topics, as Marina discussed, and the final pair of meetings into the site development subdivision, which we'll talk about more today, so you have a better comprehension of what those are. But first, we want to touch on Vision 2050, which has been discussed in a number of previous meetings. The first meeting series, Alberto gave a full overview of the comprehensive plan and the code and how these work together. I do recommend that you try to view that on the Vision 2050 website. And in the second series of meetings, I got into the sectors and place types, which I'll touch on today because there is a direct connection, but I'm not going to go into much detail. So we did quite a lot of that in the last series of meetings. So Vision 2050 overall is an update of the county's comprehensive plan. This is a document that sets countywide policies in many different situations, including growth in housing, and we'll talk about that today, infrastructure investments, economic development, and many other issues of countywide importance. In response to rapidly changing times, significant growth pressure, and an overall sentiment that growth over the past few decades has, in many cases, been detrimental to the character and function of the county, the comprehensive plan is undergoing a major change. A key revision we'll discuss today is becoming proactive in controlling where future growth will occur and the form that it takes. A couple of survey results that Alberto has shared previously will be helpful for today's subject matter. This survey, for instance, indicates that very few people know or understand the current comprehensive plan and zoning code, which is not uncommon, and that most people feel that new development that they're seeing around them is out of character with their neighborhood. These two are directly linked. Another survey suggests strong goals of preserving rural lands, agricultural lands, and existing neighborhoods, and to grow through filling in underdeveloped places in a manner that allows people to get around without a car. And this last survey indicated a preferred proximity of living, working, shopping, and recreation, and then repeated some of the prior sentiments that I just discussed. So those are important because it's upon these sentiments that Vision 2050, the comprehensive plan, and Orange Code together are aimed to redirect future growth in the county. The elements of sectors and place types as well as Orange Code, the sectors and place types are in the comprehensive plan. They're linked together, those three aspects, and they work together to provide a vision for what places should become. That's in Vision 2050, and how growth and specific development can contribute to that vision, which is in Orange Code. For those of you unfamiliar with the Land Development Code or a zoning code, in this case, they're the same thing. It's a collection of regulations that control development on individual properties. This controls how large buildings can be, where they can be located on a property, how much of the property they can cover in buildings and pavement, and the uses that are allowed within buildings and on properties, as well as details related to those uses, like how much parking is required. As I discussed in the last series of presentations, sectors, which are a very large scale tool at the comprehensive plan level, those really help determine where and to what extent new growth should occur. Grow here, but not over here, for instance. And these are the sectors in the comprehensive plan, which cover very large areas of the county. And as sectors direct growth, the majority of all new growth is encouraged in what's called targeted and intended sectors. And we'll touch on that a little bit more. But the established sector, which we do want to pull out, that covers most existing neighborhoods. And that will see very little growth. And it's also very lightly touched by Orange Code. There's not a lot of changes going on in existing neighborhoods through this process. But the targeted areas, which will see more rapid change, will be closely controlled by Orange Code to ensure a consistent and predictable outcome. The transition of height and use as development occurs near to neighborhoods, and increasing opportunities for people who are, want to walk, roll, or bike. Place types is another tool in the comprehensive plan that's more specific than sectors. These cover areas roughly the size of a neighborhood, or say the four corners at an intersection of major roads, which typically have shopping centers on them. And the place types really direct the character of those smaller areas to become something clear, like a mixed-use center or a neighborhood of low intensity or moderate intensity. So the comprehensive plan really sort of pushes that direction. And they're generally directed in intensity as well, according to the sectors. So where there's a targeted sector, that's where the intensity of growth is intended. And within the place type, it has a place type that is in itself more intensive, and that directs Orange Code. So whether a place should seriously intensify or not intensify much at all, is really part directed by the sectors in terms of the amount of change, and then by place types to determine the form that places should take in the future. There's four categories of place types. There's urban ones, which are in the urban service area, and rural ones, which are outside of the urban service area. There's open space place types, which cover natural areas and larger parks. And then special place types. Those are areas of special needs and rules, or special considerations like universities, theme parks, airports, and industrial districts. And the two fit together like this, with an intent to grow most significantly in that targeted sector, mostly through redeveloping commercial properties along major roads. At this comprehensive plan scale, though, the details of the sectors and place types are a little fuzzy, because that's the level that comprehensive plans get to. And then Orange Code takes up from there and implements sectors and place types on the ground by regulating how much and in what form development can occur on individual properties. So we'll get to some code concepts soon, but first we'll cover background, and we'll take some questions on the background before we jump into the concepts. So to begin the Orange Code rewrite process, we first took a detailed look around Orange County. There are many positive attributes and a long history. The area is growing really for a lot of these reasons, including a great and diversifying economy, a global tourist industry especially. These are situated among a strong rural and agricultural heritage and a unique natural environment that offers many opportunities for recreation as well as for conservation. Because the county has grown consistently for quite some time, there are many models of successful traditional towns and new town development upon which to model future growth. And that growth is increasingly being serviced by diversifying transit options. But there are also a number of issues. Decreasing affordability of housing is a big one. That's reflected in the lack of housing diversity in much of the county. And the pattern of past growth has also resulted in a loss of rural heritage, while delivering places that are only accessible by a car. And once you are in the car, the post-1950s development pattern really results in a lot of traffic, and nobody appreciates that. And this is especially true as employment areas are heavily concentrated, which contributes to serious traffic burdens during the morning and evening rush hours due to an imbalance between the locations of jobs and housing. We call that jobs housing balance. And if they're all really far from each other, especially concentrated jobs, then all the traffic in the morning goes one way, all the traffic in the evening goes another way, and that system just doesn't work. And to respond to the traffic volumes, the collector and arterial roads become larger and larger, and they have faster moving traffic. And as we'll talk about shortly, there are many developments that have, so that's the whole traffic thing is pretty important because those roads become, sort of uncomfortable if you have a lot of traffic and it moves really fast. But that's the result of this imbalance between jobs and housing and the pattern of development. There's another issue, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, which is that many developments have written their own standards. These are called planned developments. And really because they feel that existing codes are a mismatch with the demands of the market. Here's some examples of the mapping that were completed as part of the assessment. Because Alberto discussed a lot of this in the first set of town hall meetings, I'm just throwing these up here for context. You should really go back and watch those on the Vision 2050 website. Along with countywide mapping, studies were also completed to compare the character and detail of different areas within the county. This collection represents a portion of that work. Of course, there's a lot more. Here we looked at street types and how often there are connections in streets, the extent of sidewalks and bicycle lanes, if there are blocks or if there aren't blocks. Like a block is an area that's roughly a rectangle defined by streets, and some patterns of growth builds with blocks and some patterns don't, and that has a really big effect. And then when you do have blocks, what is the scale? Are they so large that most people would choose to drive rather than walk, for instance? And we looked at buildings and the distribution of building types, and lastly at the types of neighborhoods and centers that make up all these areas in the county. And overall, the physical assessment was aimed at describing Orange County from both a broad overall view, uncovering patterns of natural systems, commuting, housing diversity and cost, and then at a closer view to identify differences in character, which are significant across the county. Along with these, we analyzed all of the standards within your existing zones. The existing standards are on the left here, and the categorization of those standards are on the right. And you may have seen this yesterday, it was in the wrong spot, but it turned out to be applicable in this conversation because there are many, many zones currently, but there's really not that much variation in the physical standards, like how far a building must be set back from the street or the height restrictions on buildings. So we did this in order to ensure that the new Orange Code doesn't result in a change of character within existing neighborhoods. And this also helped us to determine how we could reduce the number of zones and the complexity in the new code. So logically, we must ask why the current code needs to be rewritten. So this infographic points out some very important issues. The current code is 1,200 pages long, and that's a ton of information to absorb. The new Orange Code is about 300 pages, and I'll tell you that's complex enough. Within the current 1,200 pages, there's 20 different zones for just residential uses. And because it's so long and has been patched over and over and over for so many years, there's things like 7 different definitions of building. There's all sorts of inconsistencies. And while those definitions, for example, may be similar, they can lead to confusion. There's also 11 definitions of person. And it's this lack of coordination over time is not only about definitions, though, it's also about important regulatory details, and they may contradict each other. And when that happens, it's left up to the applicant, staff, and ultimately to the commission and the Board of Zoning Appeals to determine which requirements are applicable. And that process can be long and costly. There are also 145 exceptions to rules that apply to specific uses that say you must do this except for this and this and this and this and this. And finally, 20% of unincorporated Orange County is within planned development districts. These are places that have written their own rules because the current code does not allow for places like Horizon West, for example. And while that type of development is desirable, It's difficult to permit, and once its planned development district is passed, it's also difficult to administer for county staff who have to manage significant number of overlapping rules. So that's a lot of information, but we can really just boil it down to three things. The current code is complicated, it's full of inconsistencies, and it doesn't allow development in the form that is really desired, so it's outdated. And all of those things contribute to new development being more expensive than it should be. In our initial evaluation, we found the current code to be pretty poor in doing its job. Clarity is a big problem. Even internally, we understand that new staff requires about 1.5 years to become familiar with the current code. And that is their job. Imagine a resident trying to understand zoning. It's really complicated. Organization is also very poor, including the inconsistencies that I already mentioned. And the process, while rated higher than others, can also be complicated and costly. And because the code doesn't allow the desired outcomes, most permits include waivers, and these are conditions where a code requirement is basically officially ignored. So residents complain that new development doesn't fit the character of existing places as well. So the built result is poor. And it's not even good for the developers on the other side who have to pursue costly workarounds and waivers. That takes time and costs them money. And finally, the current code does not coordinate land use and transportation and encourages growth in undeveloped areas, which fails from a sustainability standpoint. So, sorry, current code, it's time to go. And one of the reasons the current code is a problem is that it's overly focused on use and not focused on issues that affect compatibility between properties. And we'll talk a lot more about that in the second half of this presentation discussion. Similarly, the code is focused on individual properties and not the collective outcome of development of a larger area. The result of this is a lot of inconsistency. What's built on one property has very little in relationship to what's built on the neighboring property or properties nearby. And this does not create places that can be named, that can be found, or that can be loved. Instead, it perpetuates placelessness, where we spend more time in the car than we do with our families and friends. With place types in the comprehensive plan, and zones in Orange Code will be better assigned to create main streets and urban centers and downtowns, along with new neighborhoods. Here, for example, is Lake known as downtown, for instance, and this mixes shops and offices and housing. And because they're connected and they're located all along the sidewalk, they create a place, and that works for cars, but it also works for pedestrians and cyclists. And because the form of buildings is fairly similar, they're compatible with each other. So, the uses could change. It's not really so much about use, about the specific use in the building. Of course, this would not be compatible with single-story housing. You wouldn't want to build this right next door, and that's also important in the code. And later, we'll really get into how the code manages compatibility. But the existing code does not manage compatibility. And developments like this that are desirable are built outside of the code. They're built independently. And the results, as we hear from public reaction, is that new buildings are incompatible with sort of adjacent neighborhoods. But a new code approach, it's not necessarily new. Thornton Park here demonstrates many of the characteristics that new development is interested in producing. Here, at a smaller scale, as would be appropriate in many areas of the county that abut up to neighborhoods. This sort of scale of development may be desirable, but it's also not able to be built currently. Today, this would just be, it would be impossible to break all the rules. And finally, there's an issue of coordinating zoning and subdivision regulations. We'll talk about that more later. To align with Vision 2050, the subdivision rules direct the layout of streets, of open space and conservation areas. These standards are very old and direct development in a form that's no longer desirable. And in fact, we heard from staff across departments that subdivision requirements need to change. As I briefly discussed about creating places, subdivision and zoning today are both focused too much on individual properties instead of acknowledging the larger area that properties are within. And as a result, the collection of individual developments don't add up to create full neighborhoods. They're mostly just clusters of housing or clusters of shopping centers, and they require you to drive to anything that you want that's outside of that cluster. They don't come together to make places. And also the quality of open spaces suffers as a result of the current code. Open space is required at a few different levels today in the comprehensive plan and in subdivision and zoning. And additionally, it's indirectly required in order to handle stormwater. But these requirements don't ensure that open space is usable to residents. They just ensure that it's provided. Today and for decades, open space has been an afterthought, really dribbled around the outsides of development. Now, over time, developers have found out that people want open spaces that really improve their quality of life, where children can play and neighbors can meet. So all new sizable developments have proceeded through a plan development process because the codes don't really allow for the types of places where people want to invest their money and raise their family. And the quality of open spaces is one piece of this. And so lastly, I want to point out that both the development community and people who are purchasing homes have really long signaled that the existing codes are out of date. As a result, many new developments are built using their own rules in order to appeal to home buyers and retailers. And as I've already mentioned, this results in many different standards across the county, which is difficult for staff and for developers, but it's also difficult for residents to interpret. You know, how are you to interpret what is allowed in properties nearby? And because they're out of date, the process to permit the type of development that has become desirable now in return makes that type of development more expensive than it needs to be because it's not legal and it takes time. And here's a map of those areas, about 470 planned developments. And what I think is interesting is notice that they're most on the edges of already built places. And so to me, this map essentially shows that all the new growth towards the edges is opting out of the current code. You know, it's already happened. And with each are subject to their own new standards, there's just a serious lack of coordination. And so right now, the future is being dictated by one development at a time. And that's really not good planning. That's not future oriented. That's not building a vision for the county. So clearly the zoning code needs an overhaul. Orange code, which is that needed overhaul, fundamentally reworks zoning and subdivision in order to increase predictability, meaning it's easier to understand what new development will look like, and to also increase compatibility, meaning that new development is more of a similar character to neighboring places and provides a meaningful transition if it's much different. It's also focused on making places among multiple properties and developments rather than a bunch of isolated projects. As Vision 2050 is really focused on the infill development of existing commercial corridors and adding more diverse and affordable types of housing, the new Orange Code is designed to implement that vision. And as I've discussed, it's aimed at being easier to comprehend for residents, the development community, and county leadership and staff. So with a strong future vision in Vision 2050, Orange Code is able to be more streamlined and clear, directing development towards that future vision. So that's really the background. And we'll pause now for a first round of questions, if there are any, before we head into the main categories of change, the main concepts of the code.
Thank you, Matt. Can you hear me? Great. Yep. Well, I wanted to commend Commissioner Wilson for attending a second time night in a row. That's quite rare for a commissioner, and we appreciate your attendance. So far, we don't have any questions, but I will ask Alberto I'm going to ask Alberto the same question I asked yesterday to kick off this session, because I think it's one that really does speak to the characteristics of Orange County. And it's one also that maybe can reassure residents that while we really focused on what doesn't work in the code, there are things that do work, and those elements have been incorporated into the code. So, and you will see that in greater detail when we go and describe to you the different transect zones in the next series. But Matt has spent a lot of time focusing on PUDs and really the administrative headache it causes, because every PD is written to a different degree. I've seen some that are 300 pages. I've seen some that are 20 pages. And so depending on the area, depending on the wiseness of the attorneys, the land use attorneys, they're written to very different degrees of specificity. And but they often include standards which speak to what's lacking in the code. They try to distinguish between different building types. They try to create a more walkable environment. So Alberto, do PDs help or hurt?
Thank you, Marina, for the question. And PDs are a reality in Orange County. They are, in turn, the reverberation of the built environment, if you would, that you experience today. You identified as part of the presentation and the map diagrams, identifying the presence of some of those PDs. Some of them are, or all of them are identified, but some of them are in the process of becoming places. And the question is very specific about whether they help or they don't help. And I think the reality is that in some instances, PDs are required, such as the established on the outskirts of established neighborhoods. The requirement in terms of general communities, such as Horizon West, for example, which is one of the oldest sector plans in the state of Florida, that comes with a set of policies and a set of regulations that are very specific to developments. The actual process of PDs are required. And they adhere to those policies in the comprehensive plan, and they adhere to the regulations that are embedded into each one of the villages. So there is a level of predictability in that level, that specific series of neighborhoods and communities that are being formed. There are other PDs in the county that, because the developers come in with a development program that may not fit the rules within the standards of Orange County, they create their own rules. So where it hurts is that sometimes those particular developments are the element of surprise to established neighborhoods. Those residents were not under the impression that a certain level of development or intensity of development was going to happen in their backyard. So there is very little visioning associated to where this type of developments may take place. They have to go through the process, they have to be reviewed, they have to be consistent with the policies, and they have to be adopted by the Board of County Commissioners and recommended by the different entities that make the recommendation to the board. So there is a fair process and a good process established today in terms of public engagement and public awareness of what's happening. It's just that the vision itself for how Orange County continues to develop is incremental, and there is a very high element of surprise, and sometimes it's very unpredictable.
So that's a good answer, and there's 3 follow-up questions to that. So I'm going to throw them out, and Matt and or Alberto can respond. So the first one is, what will happen with the current PDs with regard to uses that have been assigned? So I want to say one thing, and then I'll turn it over to you all, and that is that PDs are vested, right? So they have been vested under the old code, and they will continue to move forward. That's not to say that there won't be a mechanism where we're hoping to find a mechanism in the code that allows some portions, right, to trend towards Orange Code where it makes sense that it be more aligned with the comprehensive plan. But that does require that they reopen up the process. Some developers may be willing to, some may not. But they are vested, but we're not going to see more of them, but we have to keep the ones that are there, correct?
Yes, that is correct. All of the PDs have pretty much gone through, again, the approval process. They are vested. They have been adopted in the comprehensive plan in terms of their specific development program. We have a policy that collects all of those development programs, so they become part of the plan. The question is, and continues to be, how would those PDs continue to implement themselves as they evolve from the land use plan into the development plans, as well as the subdivisions, the way that each one of those neighborhoods are going to be developed, which is another process, the PSPs, preliminary subdivision plans. So we have to be able to understand that there's going to be an evolution and an implementation time frame, and what that is still being evaluated and being coordinated with all the entities that have those interests. We do have to make a decision moving forward, though. I think as we continue to formulate Vision 2050 and Orange Code and provide a determination that PDs as they are structured today would not be part of a future infill or new development in Orange County. I think that is the only and fundamental reason why we are moving forward with Vision 2050 and Orange Code. And I think that needs to be clear from the get-go.
Thank you. And there is a plan. They are essentially being phased out. So the next question I'm going to direct to you, Matt, which also has to do with PDs, but it's a question about coding and enforcing in general, which is if developers are not adhering to the codes, are they adhering? Why would they adhere to codes that don't work? So why are they writing their own standard, and what holds them to those standards? And maybe you could speak a little bit about process too.
Well, there's two parts of that. I think we had heard yesterday a question of enforcement, and we discussed how it can be difficult to enforce rules that are so complex that you may not even know what the rules are with all those PDs, and that goes to the mechanism of enforcement and making that easier. But I understand there's also efforts in the works to increase the effectiveness of enforcement on the ground. But there's another piece to that, which is following the rules, and at present, everybody from say a staff perspective would say that the current code doesn't work in what the goals for growth, both from the development community and from staff and also the buyers and neighbors, are for something that isn't allowed by the code today. So what you get is negotiation for all the new standards, and there's really it's really hard to determine in that negotiated standpoint what is compatible and what's not compatible with neighbors. What is a good outcome of development is what is a poor outcome of development. And because right now the path is really through waivers and through negotiated standards, there's no clarity in terms of what the outcomes will be. It's really determined through that process, and anything could occur in that process. And so the goal here is to be very clear about things that are super important, and build a process that anticipates the type of development that's coming, and sets those standards in such a way that is compatible with neighboring areas and improves the sort of transportation functionality of the county and adds housing diversity.
Great. That's helpful. Thank you, Matt. I think I'll encourage you now to move into the next section so that we can, that's it for questions for now, but I'm sure there'll be others as part of the second introduction to what is a form-based code and what is a transect.
Well, good. Some more time at the end is always helpful. So now we're going to look at how Orange Code differs from the current zoning code and the subdivision standards. We're not going to get really into the specifics in this meeting. We have more meetings planned to dive in, but right now we want to describe the sort of topmost organizational points about how Orange Code works and why it's written in that way. First, there's a why that drives everything else, and that's predictability. I've said it a few times already. I'm going to say it a ton of times more. And so unlike the existing comprehensive plan, Vision 2050 really wants to direct future growth into specific places and formats. And using place types as a structure that we described earlier, Orange Code can then pick up from where the comprehensive plan leaves off and ensure that the zoning regulations produce built outcomes that match expectations. That's predictability. In order to best achieve predictability, a different set of tools, though, is necessary. Yet in the end, it'll be easier to comprehend. There might be some new things to learn now, but once you sort of get it and it clicks, it's easier to sort of comprehend what is expected going forward. And if neighbors and owners and developers all together know what to expect, then the outcomes of development are not a mystery. Currently, zoning has little concern with the form of buildings. Rather, it's the use and the density or the amount of commercial building area that's permitted as the primary ways that development is regulated. There are some elements of form, like setbacks, how far buildings have to be from a street or sidewalk, and the height of buildings, and those are regulated, but they're really an afterthought currently. Now, a form-based code instead begins with the form of the building first, ensuring that the building setback and the heights are similar, and that there are frequent entries, along the sidewalks. Use and density, though, are still considered, but they're secondary. And the use within these buildings really can vary greatly, along with the density within the buildings. Who's to say that that this year you have a restaurant in the space, and next year it's a cafe. Those go away, and it's a clothing store. These sorts of tenant spaces change all the time, and density. Any one of these buildings could have a variety of different densities, and we'll look at that a little bit later. So that may seem a little bit crazy to say that use and density really aren't so important. So we're going to look at those elements and sort of describe why you still regulate them, but the form is the most important thing to regulate first. So the first what in this series is use. A form-based code is really being distinguished as not being a use-based code. One of the first issues that we address in a form-based code is to simplify the uses. And we'll talk more about this in the next meeting as we talk through the use simplification process. But for now, you can see the comparison, here left to right. On the left are the specific uses addressed in the current code. You can see some of them are off the screen. And on the right is the simplification of uses for the new Orange code. And it's in the end, you can think about it this way. It's just not important to distinguish between a salon that has 6 seats and a salon that has 16 seats. Why would you split that? So diving into the minutia of different uses does not help to determine if a use will be compatible with the surroundings. And when it comes really down to it in the end, the code is supposed to do that. It's supposed to ensure compatibility between neighboring properties, and being overly focused on use distracts from what actually builds compatibility. So here's that actual, if we zoom out, the actual consolidation of uses looks more like this. The prior one was a little bit simpler, but what does it mean to consolidate uses and not be as concerned about use as we are about form? So we'll look at coffee shops as an example of this. It's a pretty simple one. So here's a coffee shop. Many people are familiar with this format. And so we would note that it's in a single-story building. It's by itself, surrounded by parking and a drive-through. It's set back from the street a certain dimension. But not all coffee shops share these characteristics. But the form of the building and parking are important. If you built this right here, if you built this in downtown Orlando, it really wouldn't make any sense, would it? So here's a coffee shop in a different context. Here's a converted home, historic home converted to business. The building here also wouldn't make much sense if you built this downtown, or even if you built this where that last coffee shop was located. But it fits pretty well into its context. It could be in a small scale neighborhood center. Maybe there's a few other small businesses. So this sort of low scale neighborhood type of business district. And that's certainly more appropriate near low scale homes than, say, a downtown building, or even that drive-through that we just looked at. This relationship between the scale and intensity of buildings that you can relate for compatibility. So here's another coffee shop, and this is along a new main street. This one, especially when we talk about uses, is interesting from the vantage point of a use-based code. Most likely, nobody considered that cats in a coffee shop would be combined in the use-based code. So as a result, permitting this business was probably pretty difficult. It was probably time-consuming, and that means it's expensive. But in any case, this cafe is distinguished from the prior from a form standpoint, mainly because it's in a 2-story building and it's next to other businesses that are built along a retail street. So here's that cafe in context, and how the form of the context here is really much more critical to control than the use. Any of these business spaces nearby is probably a different use, but they work together because they all share a similar form. So here's in a downtown building. This is a different coffee shop, a different context. And really, it's more important here in downtown that this business is within a tall building than the fact that it's a cafe. It might not be a cafe for that long. Maybe it'll be around for decades. Who knows? These sorts of uses change in buildings. So you can run a coffee shop in all sorts of buildings and all sorts of contexts. But you could not take this downtown building and locate it in anywhere that we looked at other cafes, particularly in that small converted house. That building itself, the form of the building, is compatible with downtown. It's not compatible with these other places. And while we're looking, this is also a coffee shop. It's not a good predictor of compatibility. And as a result, form-based codes deprioritize use. In a form-based code, the height of a building and the amount of activity within it, that's really what's controlled first. And the particulars of use are still addressed, but they're addressed secondarily. And that allows us to simplify uses. And simplifying uses significantly reduces the burden on businesses and building owners, as well as the specific use that's regulated. In a tenant space, like I've said, it may change over time. So it's a big burden if you have to go through this huge process to change the use in a building if you just expect that the salon is going to change to a cafe or maybe to an office. But it's certainly not just about coffee. Here's context for two different 7-Elevens, which are just a few blocks from each other, both in a downtown context. And the one on the left, that form it's really in conflict with the buildings that are surrounding it. But the one on the right, that's compatible with the surrounding buildings. So since use is not a good predictor of the form of buildings, let's look at some other ways that current codes regulate development. So here's a wonky one, floor area ratio. And this is often used to regulate development. It's a tool that restricts the total square footage of a building according to the size of the property the building's within. So these 4 images, they represent a property of 1/2 acre, and they've got buildings of different sizes and different heights. But all of these conditions have the same floor area ratio. But if you built them, they would all result in vastly different character. So while floor area ratio may be required as a control in some cases, it's really just not a good predictor of the character of new development. So if it's necessary, we deprioritize it. If it's not necessary, then we don't use it as a tool because it's really not helpful. So surprisingly, density is also a poor predictor of the character of development. For all the grief that people give over density, it's really rarely understood in terms of its sort of impact on the ground and what it really means. So here's another 4 images, and all 4 of these represent the same overall site, and they are all the same density. But you can also see that they occupy the site quite differently. On the top left, there's 4 houses, each 3,000 square feet with a garage. They occupy really a lot more of the property than the building on the bottom right. But the building on the bottom right is a 4-unit multifamily building. In the bottom left are 2 duplex homes. In the top right are 4 smaller cottages. They're all the same density, but they really occupy the site differently. They're of a totally different character. And so too often people get hung up on density as a number, but density is not a good predictor of the character of development. So to demonstrate that, let's look at these 4 pictures. So of course, there's going to be a difference in density between this big apartment building in the top left and the single family home in the bottom right. That's obvious, but where do you think the other examples here compare? So each of these images is one of these 4, 74 units to the acre, 44 units to the acre, 25 units to the acre, and 14 units to the acre. Nothing less than that. But which one is which? Just look at it for a moment. I bet you'll have an idea, and it's probably not this. Here's how the density numbers actually align. You really probably wouldn't guess that the buildings in the lower left is the most dense example of all these. Similarly, you'd probably guess that a large single-family house would be less than 14 units to the acre. And I personally would guess that big apartment building would have been more than 44 units to the acre. But there are other elements that really affect density, in particular the size of the property, the amount of land that's dedicated to parking and to open space. And there are other options for gentle density, like the accessory dwelling unit in the bottom right, that increases the density of that property, but it really doesn't change the character. But the point is that density doesn't predict character, and also that higher densities can be provided within a character that seems to be a lower density. And that can be done if the form of buildings and parking management are well designed. So you may be thinking that I'm crazy that that's 74 units to the acre on the bottom left, but I did double check it. It's accurate. This is a half block in Alexandria, Virginia, and it's designed to appear as a series of buildings, but it's 74, happens to be an acre. It's a 74 unit apartment building. So how could that be? I think having better context around density is important, as we discussed, really making housing more affordable, because the primary way to make housing more affordable is to make housing smaller and to provide more dwelling units within the same building size. So I find this chart helpful. It shows the trends in both apartment size and apartment rent over the past roughly decade. Of course, the price is going up. The price of all housing is going up. That's really no different in multifamily or single family. But the key here is that the size of units is trending down. And that has a major implication on density numbers. And if density is significantly restricted, that has a major implication on cost. So this is a critical issue for Orange County. If you want to stop growth in rural and agricultural areas, and you want to preserve existing neighborhoods, then the places where growth is directed to, the targeted sector primarily, they need to allow density numbers higher than you might think is reasonable. Now, look, most people simply don't really understand a density number. They just think that low is good. But when we look at, when we're looking here to use land efficiency, to reduce the loss of agricultural lands and to make public transportation, walking and biking more viable, then you must have higher densities where that growth is accommodated, provided it's in the right places. And that's what the sectors and the place types do, is to provide them in the right place, and then the code to provide the sort of controls of form so that they're compatible with surroundings. So here's 2 examples from my neighborhood. These are both historic buildings, and they've always been, on the right, a 2-unit building, a duplex, and on the left, a 4-unit multifamily, probably a condo, but they're amidst single-family homes. And on the left, 32 units to the acre, it's really not that dense. It seems high, but it's not that dense, particularly as apartments and condos get smaller. And also single-family homes, there's change there where there's a trend both in getting larger and getting smaller, and that has an impact on density numbers. So consider this diagram. This is one of 4 that we showed on a previous slide. These 2 quarter-acre properties could easily range from a density of 4 units to the acre to 16 units to the acre without changing the overall form of the building. The same amount of yard space, the same setbacks. The only real difference would be a few more cars to park. However, larger homes have more cars per dwelling than smaller apartments do. And car parking can be a problem if parking is located in front of buildings, but the issue is easily solved by considering form and site issues, that parking is in the right place and that access is in the right place. And Orange Code does this. But again, our goal is not to change existing neighborhoods in any substantial way. Instead, we're looking to infill corridors, shopping centers, and other properties that are not principally single-family neighborhoods. So take this example of new townhomes in downtown. These townhomes, still single-family, are 44 units per acre. And that sounds high, but the building form is controlled. The parking location and the access to that parking is well regulated. It's in the back. The result is a type of housing that can be a really good transition at the edge between, say, existing single-family areas and higher intensity development along the major corridors. And 44 units to the acre, it doesn't have to be scary. And in fact, this density can absorb a lot of new housing growth without eating up agricultural land. And it can also result in more efficient public transportation if this is located close to the major corridors. Transportation needs density to work. That's how you get ridership. And transportation systems in areas of very low density always have to be heavily, heavily subsidized. But if you have a density at transit stops around transit lines, then you can actually get many more user fees. And then a lot of these places may need fewer cars as a result. So there's this whole cycle that's necessary to connect between transportation planning, land use, and then codes, form, and density. So form, we really want to make clear that controlling the form of buildings is a better tool to control development and to ensure future compatibility with neighboring buildings. This image is from Phoenix, and we'll have a lot of sort of more intensive types of environments in examples, because again, we're not looking to make all that much change in existing neighborhoods, but we are talking about densifying corridors. And so it's very important to look at form. So this image from Phoenix is where we wrote a form-based code in 2013. It's along their light rail corridor. You can see that in the image. They just added it some years before this. And the building on the upper left, that was built using the form-based zoning code. The surrounding conditions, all the other stuff, predated that code. So first, let's look at a building size perspective. In the bottom part of the image, you can see two vastly different buildings. On the bottom left, there's a single-story building. And the bottom right, there's this gigantic tower. Those two buildings have nothing to do with each other. And together, they failed to create a cohesive place. Then the parking lot on the upper right. The parking lot's a different sort of issue that a form focus also addresses in a unified development ordinance. We'll talk about that in a moment. In this instance, the parking lot, that street is designed for pedestrians and transit with wide sidewalks and street trees and transit service. That's a really significant public investment in infrastructure. And having a parking lot along the sidewalk really wastes that public investment, as it's really incompatible with the street infrastructure. It's really not interesting. It's really unpleasant to walk on a sidewalk along parking lots. Now, the new building on the upper left, that's of a moderate scale. It's not the huge building, but it's also not the small single story, because the goal in the long range planning for this corridor is to grow at about this scale, about this height, in order to provide ridership and activities along the light rail line to drive ridership, right? So it's really intended to really match that future of the corridor, and it's designed to support the street and those walking nearby along the sidewalk. So starting with form first, we can solve most of the compatibility issues. And after form, then we can address use and performance standards. And those are layered on to further regulate the development, but form is the most important first step. So this means that the uses can be greatly simplified, because if you take a look at that top left building, it could be mixed use, it could be purely residential, that could be an office building, or it can be a hotel. So the use really isn't so important in this case. It's really the form of the building. And again, the use just might change. But form-based zoning, it's not new, and it's not even new for Orange County. The iDrive code adopted a few years ago was form-based, and there's form-based elements in many of the plan developments that have been adopted over the years. And there's plenty of others in Florida. Here's Miami, and this is a code overhaul done in 2010 that we were the primary author of. And to just show you a different scale, this is an example of a new CVS in Miami built to match the form of existing buildings that surround it, as directed by the form-based code. So the new CVS on the right, and the building on the left has been there for who knows how long. It's not all about making downtowns. It's really about making places compatible, making new development compatible with existing development. So here's a different type of example. And this is, as you look at corridors and intensification, we're not talking about this, but when you have this sort of a difference, the form-based code is also very, very important to sort of manage transitions. So in this case, the street to the left is targeted for some pretty intensive infill. And to address this condition, the form-based code requires a transition in height and form to retain compatibility with adjacent housing. This is still a more intense adjacency than would be expected in Orange Code in Orange County, but the transition considerations are important. So here's a view of that street to the right. The very tall building is up on the left, but the scale is reduced with these buildings that come closer to the street. And then those buildings are broken up and they're massing, and they have entrances along the sidewalk to create the street, to keep the street active and to relate to the entrances of the housing on the other side. They're not exactly the same, and you can make these sorts of adjustments in how you write a form-based code, but it's much more compatible than having a very, very large building up against a street of smaller homes. Now, of course, that was way more intensive, but quite a lot of development also occurs on large properties or a collection of properties, and eventually they require streets and open space. And compatibility with adjacent properties in these cases in developing larger sites is really important to be considered. So these sorts of requirements and considerations fall under subdivision regulations, and they're evaluated by reviewing a development site plan. In many cases, and presently in Orange County, the zoning code and subdivision regulations, they're really not well coordinated. And so this often occurs because they're located within different documents, or they may be under the jurisdiction of different departments. And so a unified development ordinance, that term, really solves for this problem by combining the zoning and subdivision within the same code. And that's the way that Orange Code is written. So to demonstrate the connection, we'll look at a site that, this has been presented before, but I think it works really well for this example. This is a high intensity example. So this type of development wouldn't be everywhere, but this is the sort of applicable location for a development like this. It's adjacent to major roads and highways. It's not abutting directly, many existing neighborhoods. It's kind of buffered from the one behind it to the top. But in any case, this site is large enough that Orange Code would require that it be divided into multiple blocks and multiple properties, and that open space be provided as part of that. So here's one potential way that streets could be located in order to create blocks. So those orange dots are the blocks. And Orange Code sets a maximum dimension for blocks because small blocks are easier for people to get around on foot, for people rolling, for people biking. You have a lot of different options to go from one place to another. Large blocks, on the other hand, those require cars. You really can't walk in a system of large blocks. So this level of regulation occurs within subdivision standards. Subdivision standards are also where the size, location, the use, and the type of open space is regulated. Open spaces that line the outside of the property, as we said before, are wasteful, but open space that is well-formed and integrated with development can enrich people's daily lives with recreation and interaction. And subdivision standards also regulate streets. Streets are very, very important, and pedestrian ways and other similar ways of getting around. And streets, as such an important element, you really have to get them right if you want to make a place vibrant. You want to make it walkable, and so the subdivision regulations and streets need to be considered very carefully in context with the development on the edges of that. And then finally there's buildings, and so this is where the zoning standards, the sort of vertical stuff, and the subdivision standards meet each other. So in a unified development ordinance, all of these stages are considered together and they're coordinated. A block is not complete without the buildings, and buildings, are not really, can't be located anywhere if they're not within a block. They have to be worked on together. And so, as you might imagine, the details of a street as well should change in relationship to the scale and the intensity of activities of buildings along it. So a street at a scale of development like this, very tall buildings, would be detailed much differently than a street in a neighborhood of single-story homes. So for example, here, let's look at Central Ave and Washington Street. These are not interchangeable streets. The buildings are not interchangeable either. If you took the buildings along Central and you put them on Washington Street, it would be a big mess. In addition to people being very, very mad at that outcome, it's not a predictable outcome from the context of the environment. It's totally in opposition to the context. But at the same time, if you have this much grass next to buildings that tall, it's going to get trampled. It's going to collect trash. There would be too much traffic on the street for the width of the roadway, and there wouldn't be enough sidewalk for groups of people to walk past each other. But the opposite's also true. If you took the house or that wide green along Washington, you couldn't put that on Central. That would just be out of context. So a unified development ordinance coordinates these elements. So next, we're going to look at the tool that Orange Code uses to coordinate buildings, infrastructure, and open space together. And that tool is the Transect. It's a wonky word. I know it's a wonky word. I got trying to get rid of most of the wonky words, but it's just something that you'll need to become familiar with because it's becoming very, very common as a means of managing compatibility in development and compatibility between buildings and sites and streets and open spaces really across the country. So the Transect it's really the way that compatibility is coordinated between the sort of intensity of development, between private developments individually, between the infrastructure, and between public investments that are made in infrastructure and open spaces. Now, the Transect categorizes development according to intensity, and that intensity is on a scale of 1 to 6, 6 being downtown, and 1 being natural, undeveloped, or preserved places. So we call these Transect zones, those 6 divisions, and they're really the basis for Orange Code's new zones. From the least developed to the most, there's T1 for natural lands, T2 for rural and agricultural lands, T3 for the sort of suburban single-family areas, T4 for areas sort of on the edge of the single-family areas and the edge of centers. We call them general. I'll talk about that more in a moment. T5 for centers like a main street or a smaller urban center, as we call them in place types, or a downtown area like Winter Park. That's really this T5 scale. And then T6 for really intensive areas like downtown Orlando. So this is really the same system that's used in Miami. It's also used in Phoenix, as I've shown in the other examples, and hundreds of other places across the country, and also internationally. In sort of the rural development context in Doña Ana County, New Mexico, we've also applied this countywide, and Transect zones there are used to regulate development in the city, in towns and suburbs, and also in the rural environment that has tons and tons of small hamlets and agricultural lands. But that doesn't mean that the Transect would result in Miami or Phoenix or Las Cruces in Orange County. Rather, it's just a basis of categorizing compatibility, the details of which are adjusted to match conditions in Orange County. But as a categorization system, the Transect helps to coordinate the transition in scale and the transition intensity from places that are more intense, like downtowns or say these built-up corridors, to places that are less intense, like the existing neighborhoods. And so it's a clear system to ensure the compatibility of form. Now, generically, this is done by coordinating the site, building, street, and park, the forms of all those things according to the overall intensity of activity. Density is just one aspect of this. It also includes whether there are a lot of different users or very few, a lot of different uses within a building, if the building forms are large or small, and if there are many people walking around, rolling, biking, or if there just aren't that many. In the more intense places, what we call Transect Zone 6 or T6 over there on the right, there are really more people walking the sidewalk. So guess what? Sidewalks need to be wider. There are more businesses, so streets need on-street parking. And there are more activities going on within each building, so buildings are generally larger. They take up more of their site. And that's akin to downtown. Towards the opposite end, we won't talk T1 for this, but let's say T2, the rural and agricultural area. There's many fewer uses per land area, and essentially nobody walking to get to services and shops. So here, there may be a shared bike and walking trail, but most likely separated from where cars drive, because the cars in this environment tend to travel faster and they're traveling further. And there really aren't that many people who are not driving. So it's really safer to kind of separate that facility, separate the trail. Buildings here, they're generally lower in height and they're located much further from the roads. And all along the spectrum from the rural areas to downtowns, the details of sites, buildings, streets, and open spaces changes. To further address the common reaction that such a system is generic, just look at how other places might be categorized this way. Here's an example that lays out vastly different places and categorizing how they were developed across the spectrum. Now, across the US and outside of the US, here the Transect can be used to describe the differences throughout cities and regions. The system also, here crosses many cultural boundaries. All cities have essentially downtowns and neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods that are close to downtown tend to be more intense than those that are further away from downtown. There's a common pattern. I've experienced this in Tokyo and Singapore just as clearly as here in Orlando or in Winter Park. Now, the Transect has been used in zoning in recent decades in order to coordinate all the details of this growth. This stands in opposition to the way that today's zoning manages growth, which really has no way of determining compatibility or coordinating between the infrastructure and buildings. In fact, today's zoning is generic. Like, that's what's generic is today's zoning. It's a system that began principally after World War II, and it's been replicated countlessly across the United States with no regard for local history or regional variation in building techniques or climate. So every culture builds cities and those cities vary in intensity from areas of high activity to low activity. And the Transect captures this reality and allows us to align zoning with the human tradition of cities, towns, and rural areas. So here's what today's zoning produces. Should Orange County, Florida be the same as Orange County, California, the same as Houston, the suburbs of Detroit? We could easily look at the same sort of comparison for residential areas too. Whether they're single family or multifamily. Today's zoning is generic and it's made most places in this country look just like each other. Sure, some places require more expensive landscaping, like apparently Houston here, but they're all really built the same and following the same sort of generic standards. And really none of this works for people who want to walk, people who are in a wheelchair, people who are biking, or people using public transportation. This environment doesn't work for any of those people. Now back to the Transect. Let's look section by section at the zones a little more slowly, just to give a better characterization of these. T1 here is really preserved for natural areas. In most cases, these areas are preserves, like the image on the left, with no human presence. You have lots of wetland systems in the county that are like this. However, there are other cases where T1 may be used for large county parkland. So like Wekiwa Springs State Park is an example. It has some things that are some portions that may have buildings and bridges, and it has portions that are pure nature. So T1 overall, though, is the most restrictive zone with essentially no buildings permitted aside from park structures and those buildings that may be necessary for regional utilities. T2 is for rural areas that are principally in pastoral or agricultural use. Of course, this includes, some homes that are in very, very, very large properties, and that's common within, the rural landscape. T2 has an interesting diversity of uses, though, and they're not, they're really necessary for productive use of agricultural lands and pastoral lands, and those uses that are necessary to support that economy. But building here is generally low in scale and occupies a tiny, tiny, minuscule amount of any property. And because properties are so large, destinations are really far away. So walking and biking is typically recreational rather than for transportation. And as a result, roads here are oriented more towards cars and trucks than towards pedestrians. T3 is for suburban, which are principally areas of single family housing. Here, buildings are generally low in scale and they're set back a good distance from the street. Sidewalks are needed, but they don't need to be super wide since only a small portion of daily trips are taken by foot. Usually it's only for recreation, but maybe you walk to the store, but it's just not that common. The area between the sidewalk and the street here really should be wider to allow the street trees to grow larger and to shade the street and the sidewalk because the buildings aren't doing it. And that's really important to reduce the heat radiated by the pavement. But here most trips are taken by car, and streets are slightly more balanced to the car than to cyclists and pedestrians, but cyclists are becoming increasingly important in this environment. But the Transect helps us balance those users as well. There may be some on-street parking, but in these cases, it's mostly used by visitors and younger family members, and most parking is managed in garages and driveways. T4. This includes a mix of housing at different intensities, from smaller single-family homes to townhomes and small and medium-sized multifamily buildings. It may also include some small businesses like a small salon or a law office, really limited in scale. Because there are really more people around, more housing, more people, the sidewalks in T4 need to be wider. On-street parking is really necessary. And the space between the sidewalks and the street, this often includes a little more paving. It's not just all grass or shrubs or trees, because people are accessing their parked cars, and you don't need, you really want to avoid trampling all that grass. There's a lot of solutions in the built environment like this. And because there's more people and more bikes, the streets need to be slower. the balance is really about equal between the different roadway users. Buildings here are a little taller than T3, but they're also closer to the sidewalk, and they occupy more of their property. Now we call T4 general because it's similar to many historic neighborhoods. And those historic neighborhoods mix different sizes of homes. They mix duplexes, there's small apartment buildings, and there's townhomes, along with single family homes. So you can find this in the historic neighborhoods around downtown, and also around most historic downtowns. But this type of a development stopped once zoning came along and began separating all the uses. Yet this is now the type of neighborhood that's increasing in demand. And we've seen that in our own development projects where we work for private developers, and also in some of the planned developments that you have in the county. T5, this is much like Winter Park's downtown or some smaller main streets. You have some smaller main streets around. The scale's not really that tall. It's not like downtown Orlando. There's a wide variety of uses that are mixed together, including housing. Because there are so many people on the sidewalks and so many people biking, though, the design of streets is oriented more towards those users than towards the cars. On-street parking is an important part of the zone, and sidewalks are really very wide. And there really shouldn't be any grass along them, since it would be trampled, it would collect garbage. And business uses might occur within the buildings, but also spill out onto the sidewalk. And here, buildings are located right up to the edge of the sidewalk, and they really occupy most of the property that they sit on. And finally, there's T6. These are the most intensive places, like in downtown Orlando. I won't go into detail like the others because it should be pretty clear. It's like T5, but bigger. But I will note that the zone is not really intended to be widely used in the county. So rather, it's principally targeted to I-Drive, and it already has a form-based code that uses the Transect. It may be used in a few other places, but it's this form is rare as opposed to T5 and T4 and T3. But to further prove the point that the Transect is being broadly adopted as responsible zoning and planning, just look no further than to the Florida Department of Transportation. FDOT is rapidly changing their standards in order to promote safety for all the users of the roadway. For safety for freight, for drivers, for people walking, for people in wheelchairs, for people biking, and in order to coordinate the design of streets with the intensity of buildings and uses, they've also adopted the Transect, right? Because like I said, if you're in T6, you know that there's a bunch of people on the sidewalk and there's a bunch of bikers, and there's more of a balance towards those users than towards drivers, but it's totally opposite over in T2. And so the system really helps to coordinate this balance between land use and transportation. And Orange Code plugs directly into the system to ensure that state and county roads, as well as local roads that are built by developers, are aligned to the intensity of the buildings on their edges and the uses, and that and also with the predominant mode of people that use what they're using to get around in that environment. So that's a very important connection. And also, if you read the context standards from FDOT, they're looking towards jurisdictions like Orange County to, within their comprehensive plan and within their zoning codes, to signal the character of different areas essentially in this system, so that the Department of Transportation can respond by designing roads in a way that is compatible with the land uses around it. So it's really important to connect these systems. So just to go for something even simpler, here's a diagram. This diagram we've used for many years to explain it. And you can see here, as the buildings get larger and they include more uses, the sidewalk just has to get wider, and the whole area needs to manage more people walking. It's really just that simple. But I also find this to be a pretty accessible way of conceptualizing how the Transect coordinates the details of buildings and of site design and streets. So fencing, it's very different if you're in downtown, if you're in a suburban neighborhood, or if you're in a rural area. Because zoning includes fencing standards, and it manages the sort of height and material of fencing, to not coordinate by this by the Transect creates really a lot of issues. In T5 and T6, the more intense areas, fencing really needs to be more solid, and it's usually higher. These are the bottom right images. A picket fence in downtown doesn't make a lot of sense. In suburban areas, fencing should be fairly transparent and low when it's near the street, but it may be taller and more solid along the side and rear edges of a property. And in rural areas, fencing is really about being more functional than decorative. but it varies across the transect. So nearing the end, lastly, I'll point out that the easiest way to conceptualize the transect's role in ensuring in ensuring compatibility is this. It's in conditions that are clearly miscoordinated. So we call those, in the wonky world, transect violations. But it's pretty easy to understand when there's a lack of coordination. So this is an example in Orlando. It's perfect. The building on the right would, we consider that, we'd permit that in a T6 zone, in a high intensity zone, and the building on the left in T3. T6 should not be adjacent to T3. That just doesn't, they're incompatible. And the transect makes this very clear. It clearly identifies the incompatibility of the situation. From a code perspective, we can clearly ensure that this is not allowed. And in order to pass something like this through a variance, this sort of negotiated process, the argument on the side of the developer have to be very, very, very compelling and have significant community support, because the transect clearly identifies that this is not compatible, because the transect is all about compatibility. But of course, where you have the same zone, you have compatibility, whether the use here is similar or not. While most of these buildings, here in this image are mixed use, you could imagine how they could easily differ in use, as long as the form remains similar. A building could be office or mixed use, residential. There could be a boutique hotel in here. Those uses aren't so important. It's really the form of the building that's important. So that wraps the introduction to Orange Code, and we'll take questions in a moment and for the rest of the time we have available. But please note again that there will be 2 more sets of code meetings to dive further into details. And the last item before questions is really a call to stay involved and get your neighbors and friends involved. As always, the Vision 2050 website is where you'll find more information on the comprehensive plan and Orange Code, meeting recordings, and surveys. So now I'll turn it over to Marina for further questions.
Thank you, Matt. We have some good Transect questions here, so I'm going to direct the first few ones to you. So will the ultimate plan, so of course it relates to parking, but it's an important consideration. Will the ultimate plan state code state any implications about net increase or decrease in automobile use, noting that things like parking minimums and housing sprawl will increase car usage, and mixed-use development near employment centers could cause a net decrease in automobile use?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some structures in the comprehensive plan, the place types. Those help us to really determine areas that are going to have a reduced automobile use and therefore parking standard adjustments, and those that'll be sort of similar. So in the comp plan, we have a place type for the existing suburban neighborhoods. The parking standards in these areas should remain pretty similar, because the usage of cars won't change all that much. But in a place type that is intensive in mixed use when it's redeveloped, then we tie the parking standards to adjustments to that. So there's been plenty of studies done from the 90s till now, and constantly updated, determining first how mixed use environments reduce vehicle trips and therefore reduce parking needs, because you park once and you access multiple destinations instead of moving your car to all these places. That means you need less parking spaces, but also that different uses share parking between them. And there's been a lot of analysis done, especially in recent years. Just last year, these standards have been updated, showing that that parking demand is significantly lower overall when different uses are near each other, because an office uses parking during part of the day, and apartments use it during a different part of the day. And while it's not like 100% overlap, you can significantly reduce the amount of land that you give over to parking, the cost that has as an implication to development. So that's something that we're looking at closely, and really aligning and figuring out the best way to deal with the sort of existing pattern and the future resulting pattern with these mixed use environments.
Yeah, I think just to add to what you're stating, Matt's answers are complex, because it's always a complex answer. And what you're going to realize with the Transect is that it's never one answer only. depending on context, there are multiple answers to the question. So there are areas in which parking minimums are appropriate. There are areas in which parking maximums may be appropriate. There are areas close to TODs where we're going to be more aggressive, and in single family neighborhoods where we're going to be less aggressive. So it's not a one size fits all. I think Matt did a really good job of speaking about the compatibility, but the context always matters. So in that vein, Matt, if the Transect code is adopted, which we all hope will be, what happens to the already existing areas that are incompatible?
Well, those would follow, the translation, because the zoning has followed the incompatibility. The translation would still have that incompatibility, but if there were to be redevelopment, that redevelopment would be subject to transition standards. Because the zoning, the ill has already been, the issues has already occurred. So we can't take that back, but we can set standards that if there's changes and redevelopment, that it becomes more compatible in the future.
That's right. That's right. And people realize that on their property, what a Transect-based code does is enables more options. And so we often see redevelopment of those areas sort of speed up because property owners realize, one, what's next to them is more attractive, but two, it meets the market demands, but three, it's just more permissive in general. We control form, but the uses, for example, are much more permissive, especially in the mixed use areas.
But more so, I would point out more so on the corridors than within existing neighborhoods. That sort of incompatibility. We wouldn't anticipate like a ton of change on that T3 side. It's just whether the other side can change. But that particular example, it's unfortunate, but that's what's occurred in the past, and we can be compatible in the future and in redevelopment. But it's not going to make a change tomorrow to that situation.
But there are areas that look incompatible now, which will be made more compatible, especially along corridors. For example, where there are old houses that have converted to commercial uses naturally. And they may stick out right now because they just look out of scale and out of context. But with the new code allowing them to do these uses by right, to address the street in a more pedestrian-friendly manner, they will start to become part of a larger character area that's we hope will be made more consistent. Is there maybe this question is for you, Alberto, because it's somewhat comp plan related. It's very much comp plan related. Is there a certain number of housing units that the plan is aiming to create? This would be helpful in setting expectations about our county's response to the current housing affordability crisis, which I know is something that is dear to your heart.
Yeah, so that's a very good and appropriate question to ask as we continue to better understand how the county is growing, and will continue to grow for the next 30 years, which is the targeted projected time frame of the expansion of the comprehensive plan. So we're working within that time frame. When we look at the growth from 1.4 million people that we have today, and we anticipate a 48% of today's population by the year 2050, that translates to approximately 690,000 people. With the understanding that the Vision Plan 2050 continues to be very holistic in terms of the corridors and the places that we're creating, and we tend to overlap or straddle, if you would, some of the incorporated areas so that the corridors are consistent. We are extracting the municipalities because the local government does not regulate or controls each one of their comprehensive plans or each one of their own land development codes, but we can certainly influence to the best possible intent of the definition. So with that understanding of a 48% growth of today's population, 690,000 people, and we extract the growth that will happen within each one of those municipalities, we anticipate perhaps that within Orange County alone, out of those 690,000, we would end up with approximately just over 400,000, 420,000 people. 270 some thousand would go into those municipalities. So how does that translate to the number of units that we're discussing today? The reference that we have in terms of household sizes, that number of total number of units by the year 2050 for unincorporated Orange County would be approximately just over 160,000 units. And that number of 160,000 units, that's all inclusive, affordable, attainable, market rate, of course, and all types of different product types. And I think that here we are in the middle of this projected, very accurate, I think, general understanding of how we're growing and the need to address an affordable housing crisis. And we have a 10-year action plan right now adopted or accepted by the Board of County Commissioners. The 10-year action plan really targets 35% of the projected number of units for the next 10 years in the county, which if we translate that 35% to the total number that I just mentioned of units of just over 160,000, we probably will end up with about just anywhere between 58 to 60,000 units that would be targeted for affordable and attainable. And hopefully, as part of the plan as well, we continue to address the mixing not only of land uses, but mixing of ages, mixing of levels of income in communities that are vibrant, in communities that are thriving because of the coexistence of all of these very diverse unit types, as well as families and communities. So I hope that answers the question. I know it's a long-winded response, but
well, I want to add two things to what you said, Alberto. I think the 420,000 people coming into the county 20 years ago would be coming in under a very different set of housing types than 420,000 are going to come in over the next 20 years. And that has to do with the demographic shifts in this country. And that has to do with the housing preferences that people have. And that also has to do with the household compositions. We heard, Eliza spoke a little bit about this yesterday, but we know that about 60% of American households are made up of one or two people in the household. That means that they're looking for, most of them are going to be looking for small multifamily, maybe some attached housing, and less will be looking for just a single family. The reason there's such a preponderance of single family housing is that the zoning has made it very, very easy to build that type. And the zoning, in all sorts of ways that Matt will be getting into in the next series, has made it very difficult to enable townhouses to be properly designed, because the metrics attached to them just don't pencil out in many cases. Or we see multifamily coming in and they're very huge. And so there's that missing gap that we hope that this new zoning code is really going to enable and encourage and incentivize. The other thing I just wanted to say is that I can't remember if it's the National Association of Realtors or of Home Builders, but they put out an annual survey every year that asks people what kind of environments they want to live in. And it remains somewhat consistent. About 50% of people want to be in the suburban style home, and they're willing to forego the inconveniences of having to drive everywhere for that. But 50% want to be embedded in walkable locations where they can walk to their daily needs, walk to their coffee, walk to their job if possible. And what this zoning code is going to really try to do is to identify where those areas make sense. Anyways, I don't know if Matt has anything to add or if I should just move on to the next question, because it is a complicated one.
I think you're good. You can move on.
Okay. So I'm going to two more questions. So the first one is a very easy answer. Do we have, well, it's not an easy answer. I apologize. Do we have a downtown type area in the unincorporated county? I think you touched a little bit on this, Matt, but maybe Alberto, you want to expand on iDrive, and the iDrive is the one part of the county that will have the T6, the downtown core that Matt described, and we'll be describing in much more detail in the next session.
Sure. So as again, Vision 2050 begins to identify the different types of places and the place types, we have the centers, and the most dense and intense center right now in the works continues to be International Drive, 3,600 acres of a district that is, again, continued within 5 specific goals. One of them is the completeness of that, which addresses mix of uses and in a much more walkable scale type of environment. So when we compare the level of density, the closest one to downtown would be certainly International Drive. There are other districts. When we also define downtown Orlando, there are different scales within downtown Orlando. Just adjacent to the central business district itself is Soto, which is a different scale, but is in close proximity to it. And when we understand what those different scales are, just north of 50, for example, or Colonial, there are mix of uses with multi-story buildings, more than 12 stories in certain areas. We anticipate that that there are going to be other TOD areas as we continue to grow in Orange County, in districts such as Pine Castle, for example, which has a vision already associated to the station, not only for Sunrail, the existing station that will continue to grow and densify and intensify much more than what it is right now. And certainly Meadowwoods is another area that we anticipate, just because it's close proximity to the Orlando International Airport, the gateway from the highest level of technology that is becoming a reality in front of our eyes in terms of transportation, with high-speed rail coming from South Florida with Brightline, and connecting to with spurs to other stations within the international, or hopefully leading towards International Drive. So there are other station areas that we anticipate having higher densities. Of course, not at the same scale of International Drive, but International Drive would be the one that compares the most to downtown Orlando.
Great, thank you. And there was one question that was asked. I don't know if it was if either Eliza or Mike responded in writing, so I'm just going to answer it very quickly, because the question is, will this code apply to cities within Orange County or only unincorporated areas? And it's only in Orange County, the unincorporated areas. So Matt, the last question is directed to you, and I think it sets you up nicely to describe what the next 2 sessions are going to be about, or the next 4, I should say, because the question is, how is design limited or given parameters in the form-based code, if any? Are we only looking at scale and form as a driver in terms of creating a sense of place, or is it more than that?
Well, and I think Alberto spoke a little bit about the state legislation on this issue, that gets into restrictions on style. But there are some non-stylistic elements in addition to just height and setback that have to do with issues like the frequency of entries to buildings, which is very important along sidewalks, and that's different if you're in a single-family neighborhood or in a place with multifamily or mixed use, and you do need multiple entries to buildings. So that's something that is regulated. There's also glazing. It's not overly regulated, but still regulated in terms of the minimum amount of windows and doors on the facade of a building, so you don't have big huge blank walls. So there are some standards like that, but they're non-stylistic standards. So within the zones, those sorts of things are regulated in Orange Code, and we'll look specifically at the zones and what is regulated where. I would say the least amount of regulation is on the sort of less urban scale in the single family neighborhoods, and the most amount of regulation is in the higher intensity mixed use areas, because that's where there's a lot more to consider, but none of it stylistic.
Yeah, and I think the one comment I would like to add to that, and you did speak about it, you stressed the importance of it in this presentation. What also contributes to the sense of place is aligning the public frontage to what the buildings look like. So how the buildings meet the street, what the streets look like, how are the sidewalks furnished, how are the trees planted, all of that is going to be is part of this new code that is being proposed. So there really is an alignment between the public and the private faces of the buildings and the spaces between the buildings.
Yeah, and that does have to do with whether or not, like, if your building's set back from the sidewalk, whether or not that space should be landscaped or hardscaped. If you're in a more urban area like T5, it should be hardscaped. And if you have landscaping, it needs to be raised. Those sorts of details. If you're in a less urban area, if you're in the sort of single family neighborhood fabric, that where the building is set back, that should really be landscaped and not hardscaped. So those sorts of things are in there as well. And there are some additions. It's not so much regulatory as it's encouraging entries to have stoops or porches or terraces. They're not required in any way, but what we can do is give a setback, but then allow those sorts of elements that enhance the street to be built forward of that setback, and that's creates the common characteristic of most built environments. But that's not so much a requirement or tied to very specific design standards, but more of a sort of an added bonus, if you will.
That's right, and this is actually what you just said is a perfect segue into the one other question, which is, how does the Transect plan help alleviate traffic in our area overall if the majority of the area is developed? And I think I'll ask you to speak to two things, Matt. One is enhanced walkability, which you discussed, and the other one is allowing for a mix of uses to permit people to walk and bike to get them out of their cars.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. There's two big questions there, or two big issues. Can you walk or bike, right? And then is there a reason for you to walk or bike? And the can you walk or bike has to do with the design of the streets, of course. Do you have bike lanes? Do you have sidewalks? Because places that don't have sidewalks, are the sidewalks sufficiently wide for the amount of people that are using them? So that's one part of it. But also the other part of can you is there a block structure? Like, can you go directly towards your destination? If your destination is 500 feet away, as the crow flies, do you have to navigate this crazy network of streets that takes you 1.5 miles to get you to your destination, right? Because that's a really important issue in terms of being able to use modes other than the car. And that's why there's block standards for new development to ensure that there's multiple ways to get from A to B. So then the other side of it is there a meaningful place to go? And that has to do with really encouraging not all of the jobs to be concentrated in downtown or in limited areas, but to allow for greater intensity of uses like office, but also of retail uses in direct proximity to housing, in different parts of the county. And so that affects things at two scales. One is at the sort of larger scale, which is to say, if you are living currently in a single family neighborhood and you have some services you want to access and you have to go really far to access those services or your job, that puts traffic on the street. But if that trip is shortened because now there's new development that provides the services or employment opportunity closer by, then you're reducing the overall traffic on the network. But there's also another scale, which is within the areas themselves, like where I talked about this sort of crossroads, these four corners at major intersections. If they are not just shopping centers, which a lot of them are today, in shopping centers, you drive there, park. You may just park once. You may not have to move your car, but sometimes you do, and you'll go to one or more services and then sort of drive back to wherever you're going to work at home. And so that has no what we call trip capture, almost no trip capture. But if you have housing and offices mixed together with that, with those retail uses and recreational spaces, open space together, then those people who are living in that same proximity, they're living right next door to the shops or to work, they're not driving on the road at all. And so it's a balance between both having people living in these mixed use environments where a significant number of their vehicle trips are cut down. Just with mixed use without transit, that could be between 40 and 60%. That's a lot of cars taken off the road for the amount of growth that you get. But if you have transit and functional transit, and again, transit needs that intensity and it needs these distributed destinations. If you have transit, then you can reduce, up to 80% of vehicle trips. And so it's that combination between people on site and the impact of new residents being much less in terms of traffic, but also those residents bringing life to these centers, making them more attractive and interesting, means that it's other people surrounding in less intense areas have more options of where to go, and their trips may be much shorter than they are today.
Great, thank you. That does wrap up the questions session. So I would like to open it up to the panelists to see if they have any questions. Otherwise, I want to remind people before they leave that the next series is June 7th and 8th, in which we will be going into a lot of detail as to what the Transect zones look like. It's no longer going to be R1, R2, C1, C2, but T3, T4, T5, and we'll really get into the nitty-gritty of why they look the way they do, what kind of form they're intended to encourage, and how they align with uses. So Alberto, Commissioner Wilson, you, yeah.
All right, yeah, I just really wanted to reiterate and remind folks that if you know somebody else that's interested in this presentation or any of these, that they are going to be available for watching in their recorded form. In a strange twist of fate, several people that I know out in District 1 are actually at a PD town hall going on right now because, of course, why wouldn't they be planned together? So I just want to make sure people know that they can still access this even when when it's not live. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. All right. Well, then, on that note, we want to say thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you in just shy of 2 weeks for the next round. Good night, everybody.
Thank you very much, everybody.